Hello, everyone. Welcome to Frank Analysis. I'm your host, Franco. I am joined today by Dr. Robert Malone, who is the inventor of the mRNA technology that is used for the COVID 19 injections. He went through some censorship on LinkedIn a few months ago, and he will update us on that. He will also share with us some concerns that he has on the mRNA vaccines that are being pushed by our government and mainstream media outlets. Dr. Malone, it's an honor to have you on the show. How are you?
I'm good, Franco, and thank you for the opportunity to have spend an hour with you and with your listenership
Of
viewership.
course. Yeah, thank you very much for coming on. I want to start by asking you about your professional background, just so for the people who don't know, so that they can understand your background and how did you become an expert on mRNA technology?
It basically started off of my bench at the Salk Institute when I was a graduate student between 1987 and 1989, and then I've continued advancing uh, delivery technology for polynucleotides through my academic career. uh, up until about 2000, when I switched over and started focusing on supporting the U.S. government in and others in the areas of uh, uh, rapid response to biodefense threats and engineered pathogens. So, biodefense largely for the warfighter, but also for the civilian population.
Okay. So you were recently censored on LinkedIn for speaking out about the risk of these vaccines. What exactly did you say that got you censored, and why did you feel like you needed to speak out about this? And then after that, I can show the response that LinkedIn gave you when you try to make an appeal.
So I'll take them in a couple of. I'll do it backwards from what you just suggested. Why did
Okay.
I get involved in this? And then let's talk about the censorship.
Okay.
um, I've been focused with my team on repurposing drugs for COVID since I got a call from a colleague who was in Wuhan, China, in the about January 4th of 2020, and I was working with a team that was focused under government contract for using the latest techniques, high throughput screening and high content imaging and computational docking and this kind of high tech stuff for purposes of identifying compounds for protection against organophosphates. Organophosphates are basically nerve agents as well as pesticides. So we were working on coming up drugs for those indications for the warfighter population. And then I got this alert, and we started focusing on identifying drugs that are already licensed that can be used for this purpose. I have been involved in managing outbreaks for many other pathogens before, and with my DoD colleagues was right at the tip of the spear in bringing forth the vaccine developed in Canada by Public Health Agency Canada for Ebola. This is the West African outbreak, and getting Merck involved, and we now call that the Merck Ebola vaccine. So that's just one example. Um, so I'm a vaccinologist for many, many years, but also somebody who's worked in drug repurposing. In this particular situation, I've had ongoing discussions with my colleagues at the FDA and in the Department of Defense regarding both the vaccine candidates and the various repurposed drug candidates like ivermectin. And I have colleagues who were very involved in helping manage aspects of Operation Warp Speed relating to the vaccines.
Hmm.
I have also good contacts and open discussion on a regular basis with senior people at the FDA that are outside of the review branch. Normally, you don't communicate with the review branch people except, in very constrained ways. So we've been all this various matrix of people have been discussing the vaccines and the drug candidates all the way through. And I had alerted because of what I knew about some of the manuscripts having to do with SARS-CoV-2 and particularly the spike protein, I had alerted colleagues at FDA about some potential toxicity risks associated with the spike protein back in last fall when they were still in clinical trials. In the current situation, what prompted things really that broke loose this situation for me, I usually I work with the press from time to time, but usually almost always on background. And so I really prefer to stay out of the limelight, but this a series of events have kind of thrust me out into talking to folks like you. It's not something that I have actively sought to do. It's actually not good for my business in many ways, and I'm not getting paid for any of this. It's all volunteer work. As my wife says, I'm spending hours and hours on podcasts trying to help people to understand the RNA vaccine technology and the risks and other things and the basic science. So because there's a lot of people that are confused about what this is all about and what the science means, and there's new words like mRNA that they haven't encountered before. What triggered this suddenly being thrust out on the world stage was a long conversation with a Canadian physician one Saturday night who told me about the hundreds of patients he's treated and all of the side effects from vaccines that he's seen, and that he's reported these to the Canadian version of our CDC. And every case, excuse me one moment, I still have long COVID. I got infected in late February of 2020. In any case, so this physician told me about his life and his large practice in Canada and the frustrations in treating patients with COVID and also reporting vaccine adverse events to the version of the CDC in Canada and having them just immediately dismissed without any further investigation. And they have other things going on in Canada where they're forcing communities into lockdown and saying that they won't let them out of lockdown until they have at least 70% of the people vaccinated with these experimental products. And they were doing things at the time like using ice cream to entice children to take vaccine without their parents' approval. And this was all okay with the Canadian government. So he told me these stories, and I listened for 2 hours until midnight on a Saturday. And I had to say to him, this is heartbreaking, but there's nothing I could do for you. I'm not an expert in Canadian regulatory affairs. I don't have any connections with the Canadian government. I just know, my world in DC and people I deal with. Went to bed and woke up in the morning and realized that there was something I could do. My wife and I, she has a PhD, I'm an MD with a master's. We had considerable training in bioethics and during the course of our overall training, both at University of Maryland, Baltimore, and then at Harvard University in our fellowship. We both took a postgraduate fellowship at Harvard in clinical research, regulatory affairs, and bioethics, among other things. So we put our heads together, reviewed what we knew in the history of bioethics and the structure from the Nuremberg trials, Nuremberg Code, Helsinki Accords, the Belmont Report in the United States, and then federal law. And I wrote a piece in a lay press called Trial Site News that was focused on the bioethics of experimental deployment of these COVID vaccines, the genetic vaccines. And I emphasized the fundamentals of the bioethics here. I also know quite a bit about the emergency use authorization documents and protocols. And so I put all this together as a general piece and posted it on Trial Site News. And it pretty much went viral all over the world. A lot of people had been uncomfortable with what was going on, but they really didn't know how to give voice to their feelings of unease. And this this piece kind of gave them a structure. It's if you forgive the metaphor from the Matrix, please, but it's a bit of a red pill for those who read it. And that set off a cascade of events. I was invited to speak with Brett Weinstein on the Dark Horse podcast, and we ended up with 3 old men sitting around a table live casting for a few hours, and it went viral, which I found amazing. Why somebody would want to listen to 3 old men talking for 3 hours about esoteric stuff like regulatory affairs and toxicology is beyond me, but they did. And I think what it showed was how hungry people are to try to understand these things that are going on around them and the things that the government is telling them they have to do, and this various information that they find confusing and intimidating. And so that podcast led to just a flood of physicians and scientists and patients calling me, telling me their stories, telling me about their frustrations with being censored and their clinical experiences. And then that drove me to look deeper into the safety data and signals associated with the vaccines. And I just started getting requests kind of nonstop from podcasters, but never from the mainstream media. Right. I got a lot of requests for participation in various programs, radio shows and television programs, etc., from the conservative media here in the States, which was a surprise to me because that's not my political party and it's not my alignment. Right. Although as a government employee, or not employee, but as someone who works closely with the government, I've long had to kind of check my politics at the door. This president comes and goes and another one comes in and goes and the parties switch, and it's just not a good idea for somebody like me to get too wrapped up in the politics. But this is the observation is the folks that have had interest has been the conservative media and the podcast community. I'd never interacted with folks like yourself and the podcaster community before. My wife and I decided strategically that we should, open our social media accounts and seek out alternative media. And my Twitter account exploded. It's now well over, I think it's about to hit 170,000 followers.
Wow.
That started from 200 or something before the Brett Weinstein podcast. And I've had an opportunity to interact with people from all over the world, such as yourself, that are doing these podcasts, each of which reach different communities, and each of which have different concerns and questions and points of view. It's really useful for me because it helps me to understand you and to learn from you. It's not just me teaching, I'm learning also by what are your concerns and how do I need to phrase things better so that I can effectively communicate to you about your questions and bring my understanding of the science and the medicine in a way that helps you to make sense out of the world and the things that you're seeing. So it's a two-way street, and I'm very glad to do these things. Every time I do it, it helps sharpen my thinking, and it helps me to better understand the range of people. I like to say, just in closing on this thread, I live in a purple state here in Virginia, in a very much a red county. And I run a horse farm with my wife, about 50 acres, and we have to hire laborers. And I used to be a farmer and a ranch hand before I was a physician and a scientist. And we kind of got to get along with everybody. And I pride myself on being able to talk to everybody. So hopefully we can have a good discussion here, and I won't try not to get too academic or techie. But you can tell me to, change my focus if you think that I'm doing that, or if I come across as oversimplifying things. That's not my intention. So let's talk.
Yeah, yeah, and this is how it should be. The science community should be interacting with people and informing them, but it's not really what the mainstream media is doing right now. They want to only focus on one perspective and to have us trust authority. And it's unfortunate to see, people. I myself was sharing links about ivermectin and the HCQ on Twitter, and my account would get suspended. And I've seen it happen to a lot of people. They share information about these treatments, and Twitter has a problem with that. And same thing with Facebook, as what you're going to tell us here today. LinkedIn is having a problem with that. And like the significance of this is that, like, number one, you were paying a premium subscription to be on LinkedIn, so you can have more access to network. And then number two, your history was completely wiped out from the website. Is that correct?
Yeah, they just all of a sudden, I was actually about to do a podcast from Epoch Times, or a lengthy interview, and I was in the studio, and I started getting phone calls from close colleagues saying, "What's happened to your LinkedIn account?" Which I've had for well over a decade. All kinds of history and information there, and it was just wiped as if I never existed. And they didn't send me any kind of a warning. It wasn't that they had said, "Oh, Robert, you're being naughty. Stop doing that, or we're going to retaliate against you." It was just like, boom, you're dead. Never existed. And all of that information and all of those colleagues and professional relationships are just flushed. And that was a little bit of a shock, because I use LinkedIn. I'm a consultant, and LinkedIn plays a key role for me in business development and reaching out to people. And it helps me to establish legitimacy with customers, potential consulting customers, or board members, or whatever, because they can look at what I've said over time and how long I've been doing it and the various things I've posted, and slide decks and things like that, and they can look at that and say, okay, this is a real person, and this is the kinds of things that they're able to do. So for me, it was a blow, and it triggered kind of shockwaves among many of my colleagues, and then one of them, Steve Kirsch, who's a friend in Silicon Valley, is a high net worth person that has been doing medical philanthropy. So he's been giving part of his fortune to medical causes in academics for years and years, decades. And he was the one who personally funded the trials of fluvoxamine at Washington University. Those haven't been published yet. But Steve heard what had happened to me right away. He noticed it. And he called a friend of his who is a vice president at LinkedIn. So this is a story. It has a happy ending, but it's not really a fair representation. Truly, I was privileged here. I was privileged because of my CV, my background, and my training, and my publications, but also because a colleague of mine was a high net worth person that had connections in the industry. So Steve called a vice president of LinkedIn and said, "What's going on here? I've dealt with this guy now for quite a while, and he fact checks me all the time. What's your beef?" And this set off a series of internal inquiries that are very different from what the average person would probably be able to get. And I don't say that with pride. It's just the truth. And so it triggered, they then, after his initial inquiry, they sent me a statement with examples, I think 6 different examples of posts that I had made on LinkedIn, which they believed demonstrated that I was posting medical information. Those included a Wall Street Journal editorial about repurposed drugs. So I guess the Wall Street Journal also purveys in medical information, in their opinion. It listed some repurposed drugs, I think, including the ones that you just mentioned. And another post, the top post that was listed as being inappropriate was one in which I had been fact-checked by Reuters. Reuters is a press agency, and they pay people to do fact-checking. And I had been fact-checked by Reuters, and they had concluded that I had lied about something that I'd said on the Brett Weinstein podcast. And I wrote back to them citing the specific academic papers, peer-reviewed, that had been published that supported what I had said. Of course, they didn't change anything. That's still up there. And then I complained about this on LinkedIn. And my wife that morning had identified that one of the other LinkedIn people, the chief executive officer chairman of the board of Reuters, I think his name is Doug Smith, also served on the board of directors of Pfizer. So it was a pretty clear conflict of interest, and I posted that as such, and I didn't even say that it was a conflict. I just said, does this represent a conflict of interest in your eyes, to those that are on my LinkedIn chat? And they universally responded basically, hell yes. This is a pretty clear conflict of interest, that the guy that's running the newspaper agency is also sitting on the board of the drug company that's selling the vaccine. And that was listed as my top offense, that I had done this. And then the other offenses were basically me complaining about censorship. So I was censored for complaining about censorship. None of this was, I know darn well that ivermectin is a bad word and will get you deleted, even though my colleagues at the Department of Defense were so convinced by the ivermectin data that we wish to include it in the clinical trials that we're running. But so it is. The tech gods have decided that for whatever reason, that information about ivermectin shall not be presented to the public, and yet it's being used all over the world, not because people want to give a worm drug or because of what Pierre Corey said on the Senate. It's being used all over the world because people are finding that it works. Why it works, it doesn't make complete sense. It kind of doesn't fit the classical rules of pharmacology. But you know, in my space as a clinical development person and someone involved in drug development, it's the calculations and the theory are important. But the most important thing is whether or not people respond to it clinically. Does it help make them better? And or in this case also help them avoid disease. And the data, while it's not perfect for ivermectin, to my eye and many others, it shows that it provides some benefit. It's not 100%. It's not an alternative to vaccines for those that are at high risk, but it does provide significant benefit, both as a therapeutic and as a preventative. And so it's paradoxical because at the doses it's being used, for the most part, it's one of the safest drugs on the market. It's 40 years old. It's a huge number of prescriptions for ivermectin for various kinds of parasitic diseases and head lice and things like that. I use it every month on my horses. Same drug. It's a great dewormer. And we actually use it at the same dose in the horses based on body weight that it's used safely in humans. So I had avoided talking about these knowing that they were forbidden, but it didn't matter. They still deleted me. And Steve complained, and there was additional investigations. And then a funny thing happened. People on Twitter just spontaneously, because I posted what the complaints were against me, posted that I'd been deleted. And I had the advantage of having about 100,000 followers at the time on Twitter. And they just spontaneously started deleting their accounts on LinkedIn and sending in complaints. So LinkedIn starts to get complaints from all over the world and people deleting their accounts. And this vice president is having this conversation with Steve Kirsch, and when they sent me, you could tell when they sent me this list of my sins, it was not some form letter. It was not the standard practice, because whoever the poor soul was that was given the job of writing out this set of complaints, they didn't even spell the subject line. They had misspellings in the subject line. So clearly it was a rush deal, and some poor soul got the job of putting it together and sending it out to me. And then, so this kind of snowballed, particularly, I think, as I recall, it was over the 4th of July. And maybe it was a earlier weekend, but it got picked up by the international press, and particularly by the Italian press. And there was a major Italian newspaper that put out an article about me being censored, given my background and my history as the person that originally invented the technology. And somehow all these things came together in the minds of the leadership at LinkedIn, and they decided that they were going to turn me back on again the next morning. So suddenly the account reappeared. I got an email that basically said, okay, we're going to let you off the hook this time, but you better behave. They didn't say what I needed to do to mind my manners. They just said, we might cut your neck off again at any time. So mind your manners. Metaphorically, that's what they said. And then shortly after, I received a very kind note directly from this vice president, in which he apologized. And he said he experience in brain power to censor me properly. They didn't have people that had 12 years of postgraduate education to sit around and censor people, and so they apologized and basically said, mind your manners, and we'll let you back in. Now, I can tell you, Franco, since then, my enthusiasm for LinkedIn has gone about that big. And Twitter is a battle-hardened platform. I mean, you got to be able to deal with the trolls. Fortunately, I've been doing social media for a long time. And I started back with Yahoo chat boards, and that was a pretty brutal environment. And so I just periodically on Twitter go through and cull out the trolls, when they pop up, and you can easily tell who they are. Often they have no followers. It's a brand new account, and they say the same nasty stuff again and again. They've got like playbooks. Yeah. The new form of trollery that's come out of this, though, is these pop-up fact-checker organizations. And they're funded by people like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust and Facebook. Facebook spent $80 million last year on fact-checking. And it's created this whole industry. So basically, you don't have to have any education. You don't have to be trained in journalism. You could just call yourself a fact checker and you get a check. They'll pay you to write nasty stuff about people. They may not understand it, but they understand how to write nasty stuff. And and then the problem has been that Google then is also part of this matrix. And this is not a conspiracy theory, Franco. You can look up, your listeners can look up the Trusted News Initiative. You might want to use DuckDuckGo instead of Google, but use your favorite browser and search for the term Trusted News Initiative and British Broadcasting Corporation and COVID. And you will find a press release from the BBC from last fall. There you go. Yep. In which they're very proud that they've taken the organization that they built to control basically Russian trolls during elections, and they've turned it on controlling any information that they believe is inappropriate and not aligned with the World Health Organization or the CDC here in the States, and what they say is truth. And the problem with that, of course, is that we all know that the CDC sometimes isn't sure what's truth from day to day. It flip-flops, and the same with the WHO. And you know, it's a valid question. Is the puppet master that's really controlling the strings here Pfizer? I don't know, but it sure kind of looks that way. But if you scroll down in this, Franco,
Oh yeah, that's right.
you'll see here's the little gold mine.
Yep.
The list of who's participating in the Trusted News Initiative. And you know, here we go. It's the BBC, Associated Press, Associated France Press, so that's the French AP, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, European Broadcasting Union, Financial Times, Google, YouTube, Hindu, Microsoft, Reuters, of course, Twitter, and the Washington Post, and I think there's others. So you've got this integration of government and big media, mainstream media, and new media, new technology, and the big tech providers like Microsoft, all working together, and they're all cross-linked to big pharma. And they're deciding what we're allowed to think and the words we're allowed to use and the things we're allowed to discuss. And that's the brave new world we're in. And it seems an awful lot like the one that was predicted by Mr. George Orwell in a little book he wrote called 1984.
Oh, yeah.
So there it is. That's the new reality, is neither you nor I are allowed to say certain things. Now, there seems to be little smoke signals, little signs that things may be getting better. People have written to me that they've noticed that Google has changed some of its ranking, priority ranking, having to do with anything to do with me, whereas before it was throwing these, impromptu fact checks written by undergraduates in hoodies, and that were attack pieces against me, and they were ranking that if you put in my name, which is something my wife, she's kind of the self-appointed guardian of my reputation. So she does these things. She manages our website, and she periodically looks at what Google is pointing people to with my name. And it used to be that these nasty hit pieces were always at the top, but that's not happening anymore. So I don't know whether Google has changed something, but people have written to me and others from Google, internal people that are advocating internally that Google is making a mistake in what they're doing here, and that the employees would really like it if they would stop doing that. And I think, and there's this movement by LinkedIn. So I think there might be a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. It's not all dark. And then, as if that isn't enough, we've had, over the last few days, the news about the Delta variant has just been rolling out, and it's triggered a series of very confused, almost frantic communications coming from Dr. Fauci and officialdom in HHS and in the CDC. And it comes down to a lot of the messaging that they've been officially putting out. And I also have seen internal CDC documents about their efforts to control information and messaging. Basically, the CDC and Dr. Fauci have felt that it's okay to lie to us, and they're quite clear about that. They believe they're doing it because it's in our best interest to not really know what's going on. Because if we did know all the risks and the problems that are going on, then we wouldn't take vaccine. And they've believed that the absolute most important thing is that we all take the jab. Now, that's been part of my sins also, is I have been saying clearly and consistently that this idea of universal vaccination is not a good one. And it's not how we usually do things. And furthermore, mandated vaccination, like I said in that lead-in with the bioethics, mandated vaccination for an experimental drug is just not consistent with federal law. It's not consistent with what the Western world has agreed to over decades, since World War II, that we're not going to do this. And there's certain key principles that we're supposed to follow, and everybody's agreed to it. And when we don't follow them, we get in trouble. And this is perhaps part of why the African American community in the United States, the blacks, depending on who you're talking to, their vaccine uptake rate is about 20%. Why would they be so concerned about believing what the CDC is telling them and what the US government is telling them about medicines? Well, there was this thing called the Tuskegee experiment down south, and that leaves a pretty strong impression. If you're an American that's black, that's a hard thing to forget about. And the people that did that was what was then the CDC in Atlanta. So they've got a pretty healthy skepticism about the government misleading them about things, and about the government saying that it's in your best interest to just go along and do what we tell you to. So that's I had warned about this, at the beginning of the outbreak, and then most recently, about a month ago, I put a post up on LinkedIn and then did a similar one on Twitter, where I said, well, what's going to happen to the public's confidence in the entire public health enterprise if it turns out that ivermectin is safe and has efficacy for protection against disease or treatment, and we find out that the vaccines aren't perfectly safe, which is what we were being told at the time. Now, both of those things have come true, but I said, what's going to happen to people's confidence in the public health system in the United States? And that went viral, and was just like hundreds and hundreds of people chiming in saying, we've already completely lost confidence, or it's going to completely destroy our faith in the government and in the health and human service. And people saying things like, and this is what I've been worried about, I'm not going to allow my kids to get vaccines. And if that's the price that we're paying, the destruction of confidence in the public health system, in order for a few individuals to get their way with us and mandate that we all have to take the jab, when the science doesn't support that logic, if that's the price, I think that's way too high a price. But regardless, the way that this has always been done in the past is to carefully look at what's the risk of the disease in an age block, old elderly people, healthy normal adults, adolescents, children, infants, pregnant women, people with immunodeficiencies. In all of these populations, to do a formal calculation where we figure out, hey, does this really make sense to give this vaccine to these people, given what their risk is of disease or death from this pathogen, this virus? And it's pretty clear that it makes sense, for the most part, this risk-benefit ratio about whether or not people get disease from the vaccine or they get disease from the infection, and which risk is higher. It's pretty clear that makes sense if you're an older person, like 65 or above, or somebody who's very obese or has other risk factors. But for, say, children up to the age of 18, there's been a total of about 400 that have died since the very beginning of the outbreak across the entire United States, about 400. And virtually all of those had some other major condition, like lung disease or heart disease or other things that made them very fragile. So it doesn't make sense when this vaccine can cause them to get sick in their heart, myocarditis or pericarditis, and do other things that these genetic vaccines do. And we don't even know yet, because it's all been so rushed and we haven't had time to really get all the information back in about what the risks are of the vaccine. So the truth is, we don't really know yet what those risks are. It's all a guess. And we always have to be like this during an outbreak. You never have all the information you need. But, this isn't the beginning of the outbreak anymore. We got a lot of information, and we can do those calculations. And the people that are doing them are coming back and saying, all over the world, they're saying, no, vaccination of children just doesn't make sense at all. And to the extent that it does, it's only in those children that have other major sicknesses. And it makes sense more or less for very old people. Mm-hmm. And the risk goes what we call exponential. It goes very fast. It gets higher and higher, the risk of death and disease from this virus as you get older and older. But for most folks that are between the age of, say, 35 and 55 or 60, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Right. Yeah, I'm just showing here from the, this is from the European Journal of Clinical Investigation. This is back in October 2020, just showing like global infection fatality rate is 0.15 to 0.20, but that's including people who are over 70. If you don't include those people, it's 0.03 to 0.04%. But yeah, and then like you were saying, for children, the fatality rate post-infection is very low. There's no reason for them to be taking it. And now we have a lot of people who are so afraid of this Delta variant, and there's news reports showing that people who are double vaccinated can still get the virus and pass it on to people. And I'm not sure if you came across this interview here with Dr. David Martin with Rainer Fulmich, but they were saying, based off of patents with the genetic sequences that were also cited, that this is not a novel virus and that there is no Delta variant. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, have you heard of that? Yeah, I have, and I'm not okay with that.
Okay.
I do work with these genetic sequences, and I understand that literature, and it depends. This is one of those lumpers versus splitters argument.
Okay.
If you have certain point mutations, are they sufficiently significant to call this a variant, or is it just a drifted version of the main one? The differences seem to be relatively modest, and yet there's something going on that's conferring much higher levels of replication over a shorter period of time. So this one does cause a more explosive infection, and that there's some complicated reasons why that could be happening, having to do with antibody-dependent enhancement, and so this does appear to be significantly different in its biology, how it's replicating, how it's spreading, its ability to efficiently infect people that have had the vaccine before and replicate in those people, and those people, even though they had a vaccine, are still able to infect other people. This is worrisome. This is the basis for this new CDC slide deck that I was mentioning that has been posted by the Washington Post. Apparently it was leaked to them by someone inside of CDC. That's what they say. So there does seem to be something different going on. And from my point of view, as someone who's been watching all this closely now since January of 2020, this does seem to be behaving differently, and it's alarming in many ways. And there's this talk from government officials that it's the unvaccinated that are causing the problem and causing these mutations. That's not true. That's just a lie. They don't have data showing that. And it doesn't make sense if you think about it. If your audience can just take a moment and think this through with me. So if you have, what happens with a virus is that it's like having, instead of 3 or 4 or maybe 7 children, you have 100,000 children, or more, 500,000 children or more. And because you're having so many children, your ability of your genes to make sure that each of those children are genetically perfect isn't very good, because all you care about if you're a virus is making lots and lots of offspring, lots of children. And so each of these child viruses, progeny viruses, have mutations in their genome. And when you're having 10,000 or 100,000 children, you can afford to lose a whole bunch of them, and you're still going to have lots of kids. And that's the essence of viruses, is that's their strategy. And what happens is it's classic evolution, but it's really fast compared to what you would normally see. Like if you have horses like I do and you're breeding the horses, trying to select for things, or you're breeding dogs or whatever, you know that takes a long time to get the dog that you want or the horse that you want. It takes a lot of crosses. When you got that, it's as if you were to have litters of 10,000 dogs, and it's okay if 99.9% of them don't make it, in order to get the few that are really good. And that's the way it is with viruses. And so if you've been vaccinated and you've got a leaky vaccine so that you can still get infected, it's not a perfect vaccine, and it'll still replicate in your body, these viruses, and have all these offspring, these children, then the children that come off of that virus will be under pressure by the vaccine. The vaccine is making it so it's harder for them to infect and replicate. And what you'll get is the ones that survive are the ones that have mutations that make it so they can get around the immunity that the vaccine causes. That's why it's the vaccinated people that are generating mutants. And if you have the whole population, everybody has been vaccinated, that'll happen pretty fast. If you have leaky vaccines, which these are. And that's been shown again and again and again in the laboratory and in the real world and in veterinary populations and chicken flocks and sheep and swine herds and cattle herds and everything else. This is just fundamental stuff. And so that's why a lot of virologists and folks like me say, okay, in the face of a pandemic, and there's a lot of virus out there and a lot of people infected, it makes a lot more sense to just vaccinate the people that have really high risk of disease, like the old, and then try to get drugs so that you can treat those that aren't old and aren't at high risk. But they're still going to have bad disease. This is not the flu. I guarantee I've had it. Okay, this changed my body. I'll never have the stamina I had before I got infected. It affected my lungs. It affects my life still. So it's not a good thing to get it. And it would be nice if when I got it, I had already had some drugs that I could take. But that wasn't the case. I actually treated myself with drugs that we'd identified with a computer program. And that's how I discovered one of the agents that we're testing in the clinic, which is Pepcid or famotidine, the stomach acid drug. And that does appear to have some benefits in reduction in clinical symptoms, but it's not perfect, just like ivermectin isn't perfect. Probably ivermectin is a little bit better than famotidine. Combination of the two is even better. That's the way it goes. So that's kind of what makes sense to a lot of people is to not vaccinate the whole population and put them at risk for the vaccine risks. Vaccinate the people that are at high risk for the disease and let the natural infection happen with the rest of us and treat those that have the disease. Because one of the things that's important to recognize with this is that the virus infection is necessary, but it's not enough to give the disease. The disease is a separate thing. It's not just the virus infection, it's the body's reaction to the virus infection, okay? So we talk about inflammatory or hyperinflammatory symptoms or ARDS symptoms. There's a bunch of words, cytokine cascade, you hear these words, but they're all meaning that this is a disease of your body overreacting to the virus infection. The virus infection itself is kind of like an influenza infection in terms of severity, maybe a little worse. But what really gets you, and what really got me, is your body's reaction to that virus. The good news is we have a lot of drugs for inflammatory symptoms. That's what we're talking about, is inflammatory syndromes.
So also
And
there's
those
an area.
are,
Oh, sorry.
many of them are off patent. It's okay. So those things that are pulled from that part of our pharmacopoeia, anti-inflammatories, can have a huge effect, and that's probably also how ivermectin's working. So Franco, I hope that helped.
Yeah, that really helps to clarify some things. And also, I just want to add on and ask that an area of concern regarding the virus and the vaccine are the spike proteins, and how these proteins have some relation to blood coagulation and potentially autoimmune diseases. Is that right? And could you tell us more about that and what exactly are the spike proteins?
Okay, so on the surface of a virus, okay, let's imagine the virus is a ball, like the satellites in your background, the planets. If a virus is like a little teeny tiny ball, and its genome, its RNA in this case, is inside the ball, if that wants to infect a cell, the ball has to have something on its surface that will cause that ball to stick to the cell that it wants to stick to. That thing that sticks out like a little knob has specific proteins on its end that are kind of sticky for certain types of cells. It interacts with a cellular receptor called ACE2 that are present on the cells that line your blood vessels, among other things. And the thing that does the sticking part, that sticks out of that tennis ball, it's more like, I guess it's like a Nerf ball, if you ever seen one of those, or a Cush ball with all the little prongs that stick out. And each one of those has a sticky thing on the side, on the ends, and that sticky thing binds to its receptor called ACE2. And that protein that sticks out like a knob from the surface of the virus, in this case, is called spike. In other viruses, it's called things like hemagglutinin. But here it's called spike. In influenza, it's hemagglutinin. And the spike protein does something that happens with a lot of other viruses. It's really quite clever. It is actually 3 parts, and they form kind of a cup. You can think of it as like a baseball glove. Okay? And the baseball glove, but there's 3 baseball gloves. They all fit together. And they're set there to catch a ball. But the ball they catch is their receptor. Okay, the ACE2 receptor. So that's what they do. And once they catch that ball on the inside, they kind of close around it and they change their shape. And when they change their shape, it pulls the virus into close to the cell and kind of pops a hole in the surface of your cells. And then it injects its genes into your cell. That's how that works. And so The logic is this is a thing that sticks out of the virus. It's easy to get antibodies against it. This is the part of your immune response. And so if we use that same thing and we put it in the vaccine, and what we do with these genetic vaccines is we actually take the genes that make that and we package them in special ways so that instead of being inserted into your cells using the virus method, we use other methods. But we insert just these genes that code for spike into your cells, and then your cells become like a little teeny tiny vaccine manufacturing plant. So they start making the protein that your immune system reacts to. And that protein can be pretty much anything that you put into that gene delivery preparation. It could be any of the proteins from the virus, but the one that the people that designed all of these vaccines, genetic vaccines, so that's adenovirus like J&J or Sanofi, AstraZeneca, those are adenovirus ones, or Pfizer, that's actually made by BioNTech, that's an mRNA vaccine designed in Germany, or Moderna, that's an mRNA vaccine that's designed at the NIH here in the States and manufactured in the States. Any of those technologies are basically gene therapy methods applied to vaccines. And you could take any gene, any protein coding sequence that you want, and put it into one of those things, get those into your cells, and your cells start making them. So spike was the choice of all these because it was known that spike would make a really strong immune reaction. And at the time when they did the design, they didn't know that spike had other activities, like you were talking about, triggering blood coagulation and opening up the blood-brain barrier, which is not a good thing, and damaging vascular endothelial cells, and triggering clotting, like microcoagulopathy, and causing constriction of the microvasculature, which will also trigger blood clotting on a very small scale, etc. They didn't know about all these toxicities. And some people say, well, all those toxicities are with the virus spike, but they're not with the vaccine spike. Well, that's actually not true. That's kind of wishful thinking. But the truth is that the FDA should have forced the vaccine developers to rigorously characterize the safety of the spike, and they didn't. They kind of gave them a pass. And they didn't actually force them to characterize how much spike is being made in your body after you get the jab, and where it's being made, and for how long it's being made. So we really don't know any of those things. What we now know, we didn't know then, is that the spike protein itself is toxic. And I've been fact-checked by Reuters about this, and their position is, well, you haven't proven, yes, the spike protein in the virus is toxic, but you haven't proven that the spike protein in the vaccines is toxic, but it's basically the same protein. They only mutated 2 amino acids, 2 little building blocks, and they made it so that, remember I mentioned that spike is like an open baseball glove, and then after it gets its target, it closes up like it's caught the ball. And they added a couple little changes that makes it so it can't close up. But that's all. They didn't do that to keep it from being less toxic. They did it because they thought it would make it a better antigen. It would get a better antibody response to the inside of the glove, which is where they thought they had to have antibodies. Now, since then, we've learned that that's actually not where the good antibodies are targeting. They're targeting the fingers at the outside of the glove, and they're targeting the junction where the 2 gloves come together. That's where the good antibodies are against. So that whole idea of putting those 2 mutations actually wasn't necessary. But that's kind of inside baseball, and you don't really need to know all that. But the truth is that the way the rules are with drug development and vaccine development, I like to say it's like the French judicial system. In France, if the cop gets you, the rules are you're guilty until you prove that you're innocent. Okay, upside down from the United States. But that's kind of the way it is with drug development. You have to assume that anything you're going to put in somebody's body is toxic. And your job is you have to prove that it's not toxic. That hasn't been done. So we don't really know if the spike is toxic or non-toxic because they got a pass and they didn't have to do the work that normally they would have to do. And I don't know why that happened. I don't know what they were thinking at the FDA. We could speculate. Maybe they all thought they were going to get jobs with Pfizer when they left. I don't know. But it happened. And so that's the story with Spike, is that's where it comes from. It was chosen because it was kind of the most obvious thing. But the people that did the choosing didn't think through, what happens if this goes sideways? What happens if this isn't safe? They just didn't think about that because they were in such a rush. And so many people now are starting to say, okay, for second generation products, new and improved version, maybe we ought to not have the full length spike. Maybe we ought to have some other proteins. Maybe we ought to use just little parts of the spike that are the immunogenic parts and not the other parts that cause all these other problems. And I think that's going to come out if the pharmaceutical companies will allow it and the government will allow it. Does that help?
That really helps. Yeah, thank you for breaking things down. I could ask you so many more questions, but I know you have to head out. And I know you like to focus mainly like on the science and not speculate too much like on the money motivations behind these institutions. But yeah, Dr. Malone, again, it's an honor to have you on. Thank you very much for breaking all of this down. And yeah, it was a pleasure.
Likewise, Franco, and I wish the best to all of us and to your listenership and viewership and yourself. And stay alert and think for yourself. That's my message to you. Is don't lose hope. But I think we all have to stand up for our rights. And one of our rights is that it's your body. It doesn't belong to the government yet. And you should get educated and make your own decisions to the best of your ability. And we'll get through this. I'm pretty sure, but we're not out of the woods yet. We still got a ways to go.
Yeah, and I think it's brave that you spoke up, and you're making the rounds as well and trying to inform people. I think that's very much needed. And this is a post-partisan issue. It doesn't matter who you're delivering the message to. At the end of the day, we're all people, and we should all be informed about the truth. So, Dr. Malone, again, thank you very much, and everybody else, thank you very much for watching. And don't forget to stay informed. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye, Franco.